Okay, so our next speaker is Daniel Andler. So Daniel is an emeritus professor at the Sorbonne University and a member of the Académie des sciences morales et politiques. So Daniel began his academic career as a mathematician, especially working in logic, and then became more interested in the philosophy of science, and especially cognitive sciences and artificial intelligence. And I guess that really makes the nice, again, showing that all these fields are really are interacting with each other. So today, Daniel will talk to us about whether having a body is sufficient or a necessary condition for AI systems. And I guess, I don't know if you're like me, but the roboticist, I think this is a fundamental question that I find is fascinating. So very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very risky thing to ask such a question in this audience. Before I tell you why I'm among you and thankful to be, I'd like to say just one word about myself. It is so moving to me to find myself, and it's rare, it happens once in a while, to be among mathematicians. I mean, that's my original family. So I have the impression when I'm in an audience such as this and see mathematics on the screen, I feel I'm back home again, but it's a home that I've left so long ago that I know that I'll be an expatriate all my life. So guess who was on the faculty when I walked into the Berkeley Math Department in 1969? None other than Dubin, in fact. He was a professor there. So why am I here? Well, let me show you the next slide. I was approached by Jean-Paul. We'd been in touch, but not for such a long time and not in any particularly deep way. He asked me to come and comment on one of his papers once or twice, but we weren't very close. But then, as a member of Académie des sciences, he asked me to co-organize with him this workshop with the Académie des sciences morales et politiques, of which I'm a member. And so for very, very intense 8 months or 9 months or a year, I don't remember, he and I worked very hard trying to set this thing up. And we had the assistance of Céline, whose drawing you have, that's hers, and it'll be also on the next slide. And so, as you will see from this is the talk that Jean-Paul gave, Robotics, Intelligence Facing Reality. So you see, I think Ken was saying something about reality just a while ago. So clearly Jean-Paul was interested in some fundamental questions and was willing to ask them in a naive question, in a frontal question, in a frontal way. And I think that's the way to do it, at least once in a while, before we fall back in conversations between specialists. So this is what I'm going to try and do in a short while. I forgot to start my watch, so I'm not very good at controlling time, I'm afraid. There we go. Okay, so first of all, one quick question. How does AI feel about intelligence? Remember in the beginning, we had those statements by such luminaries, pioneers as Minsky. In a few years, we'll have a fully intelligent machine of the full human sense, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Minsky was not the only pioneer to say such things. Newell and Simon and several others said the same. So that was the late 60s, early 70s. And then there were winters of AI, you remember. There was a winter in the late 70s, and then there was a second winter from the late 80s to the early 90s. And so essentially the profession sobered up, and it decided to entirely forget about, so-called strong AI, that is AI with consciousness, AI with understanding. It decided to forget about human-like intelligence, about general intelligence, about autonomy in the sense of being autonomous of the intelligence of the programmer and of intelligence altogether. That was just not interesting to be talking about intelligence in general. One excuse being that nobody knows what intelligence is, and we heard Ken say this. It's false. It's not quite true, but it's an easy way out. Nobody knows what intelligence is. Okay. So the name of the game in this sober period was so-called narrow AI. So the point was to do intelligent things precisely without intelligence. And how to do it was to can as, put in a can or in a bottle, knowledge, and then automatize processes one domain at a time. So all of this is absolutely familiar. And the only reason I bring it up is that, of course, with deep learning, whose claims are somewhat exaggerated, I agree with Ken, well, suddenly the vision of a fully intelligent machine, of a really intelligent machine, is back. That's the vision is coming back. So how do we know? Well, it shows in interviews. I don't think it shows in academic papers, but in interviews, except from this community of the so-called general artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, that's sort of a sect that really is actively pursuing real intelligence. But the mainstream of AI doesn't really say this. It's in interviews that the leaders of the profession, especially the leaders of deep learning, somehow betray their real goal. So we have these quotes from, I have one quote by each of the three musketeers, Benjo, Lequin, and Hinton. And each of those quotes, which I won't read, you can do that by yourselves, clearly says, look, our machines are dumb, so we have to, we have to do something about it, and they don't exactly agree on what we should do about it, but there is something to be done. And why? Well, because we don't want to be stuck with dumb machines. We want really intelligent machines. So that's why we can again talk about AI's ambition to generate real intelligence. So the second part of my talk is about embodied cognition and robotified AI. Pretty obvious. I don't even need to, put up my slides. You know what I'm going to say, but I'll say it nonetheless. First of all, a short slide on the allure of embodied human cognition. So this is the idea, the general idea. The body plays a major role in human cognition, and that's very plausible for several reasons. First of all, we can say that cognition has evolved and has taken the body on board, so to speak, with reciprocal effect. We can say that the body gives access to important resources. So, for example, information about the physical makeup of the world, about other people, and what people are up to when they interact, cooperate, learn, survive, mate, etc. The body provides a rich ontology, which is reflected in language, and this relates to Céline's talk, who didn't mention the fact that there's a whole school, but I'm sure she knows about it, in semantics and cognitive semantics with people such as Len Talmy from Berkeley again, and George Lakoff, Berkeley again, who emphasized the fact that our language is shot through with spatial ontology. So how do you get, if we follow them, we couldn't be talking with this extraordinary ease of communication and so on the way we do if we didn't have at our disposal these spatial metaphors. And how do we get spatial metaphors if not by being familiar from the day one with space and movement? And so there are many reasons why it's perfectly reasonable, plausible to suppose that our body plays an important role in our cognition. But now we raise the difficult questions. What exactly does embodiment consist in? What parts or dimensions of cognition are concerned by embodiment? How much, and that's more of a sociological or historical question, how much has the embodiment paradigm actually achieved for cognitive science over the last 20 years or so? I'm asking those questions not as a means to cast doubt on the brute fact that, again, cognition is embodied in one way or another, but to draw attention to the fact that how to take account of that embodiment is anything but obvious. Still, it wouldn't make sense to wait until these questions are satisfactorily settled, all the less so as it may never happen. Some of these questions are deeply philosophical, and as Ken suggested, it might be a long, long time before we agree on a full response or answer. So it wouldn't make sense to wait until these questions are fully settled to explore the implication of embodiment for AI. And so let's go artificial. And so here there's a apparently self-evident inference. First of all, AI aims at recreating human cognition in artificial systems. 2, human cognition requires or rests on its being embodied. 3, AI has up to now failed to recreate human cognition. 4, AI has up to now remained a disembodied phenomenon. So it follows that in order to succeed, AI needs to be embodied. That is, to be equipped with a robot or embedded in a robot. So that's the self-evident inference, but is it really evident? So to make things a little bit difficult, I want to raise 2 objections. First of all, AI aims at recreating human intelligence, maybe not the whole of human cognition. So of course, we'd have to go into an elaborate discussion of the relation between cognition and intelligence. For some, it's the same. I remember in his general introduction to the 4-volume MIT encyclopedia, not in the encyclopedia, but the sort of 4-volume textbook on AI directed by the psychologist Daniel Andler, who was a friend of mine. I mean, he still is, but we don't really interact very much. And he said, just to present what cognitive science is or cognition is, it's just the exercise of human intelligence. For him, it's the same. But I contest that. I think it's useful to distinguish intelligence from cognition in general. So what do we mean, or what does AI actually mean by intelligence? I don't think it quite means just cognition. And then, of course, the second objection is that the inference is best plausible. It's not deductive, right? I mean, look, the first planes failed to fly, okay, and someone could have said, look, they failed to fly. They're not like birds. Let's make them like birds, and then they will fly, right? So it's the same sort of inference. So it's possible, it's plausible, but it's not deductive. So let's take a second look at intelligence. So there, I'm on very, very slippery terrain. I'm aware of that. So intelligence is usually defined in terms of problem solving with bells and whistles. I mean, I've looked at there are 120 definitions of intelligence that have been, more or less taxonomized. But basically, there's this idea that intelligence consists in the ability to solve problems, all sorts of problems, et cetera, et cetera. That's the bells and whistles we don't have time to go into. And I claim that if you take problem, more or less in the strict sense, and the paradigm of the strict sense is what we do to, we're given a problem to pass our qualifying exam in math. There's a problem, there's a unique solution, and if we're smart enough, we're working enough, we've solved it. I claim that's a good sort of paradigm, a good example of what a real problem is. It's put forward, it's set by a professor or by nature, and there is a solution, and the challenge is to find the solution. And I think that's in fact how the notion of problem is understood, at least in practice, maybe not in the theoretical, explicit way, but implicitly that's the notion of problem that AI rests on. So if you take problem in that sense, and if you agree that AI is after a general problem-solving capacity, ability, then it's no longer obvious that intelligence is, in fact, amounts to cognition. There are lots of other things in cognition that are not about solving problem in the strict sense. And it's no longer obvious that having a body is necessary for having a human-like ability to solve problems, although it might help. So the objection would be, I think, that having a body makes it possible to inhabit the world, as opposed to merely possessing an internal model of it, right? That's the Brooks line and many others. So it makes it possible to react to novel events or evolving situations in real time. But it may not be the only way. So being present on the spot might be a constraint that seemed inescapable maybe in the old days of AI, of symbolic AI, with very slow computers and small memories and so on. But with present-day computational power, we might free ourselves of that constraint. Again, I'm not claiming that it doesn't help to be in the world, but I'm saying that it's not a necessary condition. And one able commentator of AI, François Chollet, who works with Google, I think has the same opinion. He denies the fact that AI requires a body. Okay, so, and just because I'm again reminded of my mathematical past, it suddenly occurs to me that when I was a very young assistant at Orsay, way back, and we had a blind colleague, and he was interested in sphere reversion, and he was trying to explain, and I was there. He was just standing outside the math building, and he was explaining to someone who didn't get it how to put the sphere inside out. And although he was blind by birth, he was constantly saying, "But you see, can't you see? Can't you see how it works?" So you don't need eyesight, in order to get some notions of seeing. And maybe we have the same thing. For intelligence, we might get disembodied intelligence doing the work of embodied intelligence. So these are doubts. I'm not making any strong claim there. So let me take a second look at intelligence, and let me give you my unorthodox proposal for what intelligence is. And I'm going to run into trouble, I know that, but you know, what is life at my age if you don't take risks? So I say that intelligence is the capacity to do the right thing. That is, to deal with a situation appropriately. Now, what do I mean by situation? Of course, it's a very broad word, and I have no particular claim on what it really means, but this is what I mean by situation in this context. It's a singular, particular state of affairs attached to a particular person who is part of it, has a stake in it, and has a perspective on it. So that's typically my case right now. I'm in this particular situation. I'm facing you, hoping that you will hear me to the end. And I have a stake in it. I don't want to make a fool of myself. I have a perspective on it, etc. So that's what I call a situation. Now, there's a third part of third aspect, which I will, for the sake of time, not discuss. Of course, appropriate, what the right thing to do is, what the appropriate behavior is a normative concept. And there's a lot to say about it, but I think I can skip it just for today. So my point is, what is required for being in a situation? So I'm sort of trying to make my way back into the notion that indeed intelligence requires a body. And this is the way I'm trying to do it. So you have to be an integral part of the world. Inter alia, you have to interact with real entities. That requires having a body, and a body that is one's own, and that one knows to be one's own. So those two last things, especially the last one, get a little bit delicate. And this is almost my last slide, so I'm going to leave you with essentially a puzzle on knowing that my body is mine. But I'm sure there's resonance in, the thoughts that you've had as roboticists, of course. So this is the bug. Having a body, knowing all there is to know about one's body, the position of one's body in space, the degrees of freedom, etc., and yet it's possible, I claim, that's why there's a bug, not knowing that it is mine in the right way. So what seems to be missing is what philosophers and linguists are calling a décès representation of one's body. Décès, they claim, and I tend to agree with them, but there's endless discussion about that among philosophers. A décès representation of one's body, a perspectival representation of one's body is not entailed by any non-perspectival facts. Fred can believe that Fred is tall without believing that he himself is tall in circumstances such that Fred doesn't realize that he is Fred. So this is what philosophers, and I think the expression is that of John Perry, a very able philosopher, a very popular philosopher also at Stanford, what he called an essential indexical. So clearly we humans have correct décès representations of belief in normal circumstances. So this thing about Fred being tall, knowing that he's tall but not knowing that it's he himself that's tall, involve intricate scenarios. They're tons. They're very amusing, in fact. But they're scenarios, sort of unlikely circumstances. In normal circumstances, of course, I know that I'm speaking, Daniel Andler, am risking my reputation and so on. It's really me. No doubt about it. So that's not in question. But the problem is, for philosophy, to try to account for décès beliefs or essential indexicals. What exact cognitive mechanisms are at work that allow me to know that I am the person speaking right now? And for cognitive roboticists, the problem is whether they can equip an intelligent robot with décès beliefs. So, oops. No, won't move. So wrapping up, it's about time, a little behind, sorry. So if AI aims at human-like intelligence, if I'm right in claiming that's the goal, if 2, intelligence is the ability to engage with a situation appropriately, if 3, the ability to engage appropriately or not, in fact, with a situation requires having a body being embodied, then being embedded in a robot is necessary for being intelligent, but it may be sufficient only if the robot has a décès representation of itself. And this may require, for example, some kind of self-aware ownership of one's body. Maybe developmental robotics can teach us something about that. That's it. Thank you. Resting my case with the hope that my question rings a bell.